Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Mike Foote. I'm representing the Family and Community Coalition. Great, thank you. My name is Mike Foote. I'm representing the Family and Community Coalition, abbreviated as FCC. And we're made up of 4 different grassroots community groups. That's the Black Parents United Foundation, Greenhouse Connection Center, Mothers Out Front, and Mountain Mamas. And collectively, through the organization's memberships that are part of the coalition, we have folks that live in all 18 of the Gym 2 locations around the state. The purpose of our coalition is to make sure that these grassroots community groups have a seat at the table during these deliberations and that their voices are elevated during these discussions, including at this presentation. And I'll tell you that the voices in these communities, and the voices in this coalition are frustrated. They're frustrated because their communities have been heavily polluted for years, for decades even, by many sources. Some of the communities have been referred to as sacrifice zones for the rest of the state of Colorado. They're frustrated that they've suffered and continue to suffer immense harm from this pollution. And they see that business as usual seems to continue despite their speaking up in different forums. Their experience is that people often do listen to what they have to say, but in the end don't really make too many real changes as a result. It's kind of like their opinion has been welcome, their voices have been heard, and the health and well-being of those communities seem to be important. But the line between listening and acting seems to be drawn at whether some facilities might have to cut into their profit margins to comply with the new regulation. Now, the legislature did listen and did actually act in 2021 when it passed the Environmental Justice Act. But the communities have to count on you, the commissioners, in order to make sure real change occurs as was intended by the legislators when they passed the act. The communities want the commission to follow the law as intended by the legislature and make sure that disproportionately impacted communities are protected and that co-pollutant reductions are prioritized, not just in word, but in deed. I'm going to highlight the portion of the Environmental Justice Act that we're most focused on and talk about that for just a little bit, but the bulk of this presentation will be taken up by coalition community members. It's important that their perspectives are put front and center here in this presentation. And unfortunately, the clicker doesn't seem to be working. Whoever can troubleshoot for this presentation, I apologize.
No problem. I passed your time. There you go.
Great, thank you. So, as I mentioned, there's one particular part of the statute that we've been focused on. Of course, you've heard about it already, and I'm not going to focus a lot of time on it, but it revolves around section 25.7.103.1E13. And the first clause of that section you've heard about from other parties. But the second clause of that subsection talks about factors that need to be taken into account. And these things that are cross-referenced in the statute are important things to consider. There are things like compliance flexibility, the benefits of the rule, the cost of compliance, economic impacts, cost effectiveness, and those types of factors. And as I said, those are important things to consider. But the statute does require the weighing of those factors and those things to be taken into account, but not any of them are automatically disqualified. In contrast, this is the part of the subsection that dictates what the rule must include. The rules must include protections for disproportionately impacted communities. They must prioritize emission reductions that will reduce emissions of co-pollutants that adversely affect those disproportionately impacted communities. And our main concern is that the proposed rule with its cost threshold for on-site improvements and on-site reductions takes that consideration, those considerations in the first part that I mentioned on the previous slide, and turns it into a low, bright line exclusion. Any on-site reduction below the threshold would be completed, but anything above the cost threshold does not need to be done, and we know will not be done if it's not mandated to be done. And that's not the statutory standard. First and foremost, co-pollution reductions in DICs shall be prioritized. Other factors, as I mentioned, like cost effectiveness, shall be considered. But when one conflicts with the other, the mandatory requirement takes precedence. The bottom line here for this coalition that we've mentioned in our filings as well as today is that we don't see any significant on-site co-pollutant reductions occurring as a result of this proposed rule. So as I mentioned, I want to turn it over to 3 community members that you're going to hear about, and then I'll wrap it up briefly if we have any time left. But they're going to talk about, and they're going to highlight why following this subsection is so important, and why the on-site reductions that are mandated in this subsection are so important to their communities. You're first going to hear from Lucy Molina, then you'll hear from Don Diaz, and then you'll finally hear from Cummings. And as I mentioned, I will just wrap it up very briefly after that. So first, Ms. Molina. If you need it.
Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah? Yeah. Hola, buenas noches, buenas tardes. Thank you very much for your public service. Just a reminder that justice is not charity, all right, y'all? Hola, my name is Lucy Molina. I am a single mother of 2 beautiful, linguistically talented children. I grew up in Elyria, Swansea, with Purina as my neighbor across the highway. Now I live in Commerce City, next to the oil refinery Suncor, my deadly neighbor, where we have no drinking water, our air and land are contaminated, and have been for years. In 2019, our community was offered a free car wash when Suncor blew it. It spewed out deadly poisonous toxins into our neighborhoods, onto our yards, vehicles, parks, and homes. Our nearby schools went into lockdown as yellowish ash fell from the sky. I ask you all, what is the difference here in this rulemaking? It's no difference than offering us a car wash, which was really an insult to our community. When we'll be taken seriously? Environmental racism is nothing new for our communities, right? It's been happening for decades in marginalized communities like mine. Our communities have carried the burden. Due to the health impacts like migraines and bloody noses, my children's education has even been impacted. Missing days of school, work because of hospitalizations, threats of truancy have been a challenge for me as a single mother throughout their education. For decades, my family and neighbors have suffered great health impacts from leukemia, lupus, heart disease, cancer, asthma, diabetes, migraines, bloody noses, just to name a few. My grandmother died of leukemia in 2018. My great-grandmother died of cancer in 79. And currently, both my aunt and uncle are fighting cancer. They're still young. Most recently, in August, I lost a family member to brain disease. She was 52. And 2 neighbors to cancer, 48 and 63 years old. 2 funerals in 1 week. It has become normal for our communities, early deaths. While the industry continues to make billions, and so we will continue to suffer and die. This is environmental injustice. Colorado has made bold climate legislation in the past few years, becoming an example for the nation. The EJ Act is supposed to protect us, the people, the impacted communities, not give industry a free ride and backdoor deals. We must take a giant leap forward and bring forth true justice. No baby steps here. Industry has had enough time to bank from human misery. It's time to enforce current legislation to its fullest potential, not adding to the environmental injustice by watering it down with rules that favor the polluters. I know many are here just to protect their paychecks. I am trying to save lives here. Accountability matters. Environmental justice to me looks like this: strongest enforcement. Self-regulation doesn't work. Restorative justice, reparations, a full just transition beginning in communities like mine. Health assessment, access to clean energy, solar, electrification. These should be accessible as a flu shot or a COVID vaccine. Language justice, talk to the people, talk to us. Food justice, permanent housing, mass education, and awareness. Environmental justice is climate justice. We are no longer in a global warming, but a global boiling. And it's horrifying to me that we must continue to fight our own governments for basic human needs such as clean water and air. Time is running out. The future is now. 2030 is just days away. And with rules like these, Colorado, we will continue to kick the can down the road until it's too late. No more stinky business, y'all. You cannot do this without us, the people. Gracias.
Hi, my name is Don Angel Diaz. I live in the Globeville community, which is about 2 miles from the Suncor plant. I am the great-granddaughter of Josephine, Ramona, Augustine, Stella, John, Guadalupe, and Francisco. I am the granddaughter of Evan, Tony, Irene, and Augustine Jr. I am the daughter of Donald and Gloria. I am the mother of 5 children and the wife of my husband. I would like to thank you for holding space for us to speak our truths and life as residents near Suncor. I come before you today and ask that your minds and hearts be open to hear our voices as we ask you to correct your wrongs. I ask today that there are no longer any barriers that will stop you from reducing the pollution that you are putting into our communities. When I first became aware that my community had the worst air quality in all of the nation, I had questions for my father. I asked him, why would you buy a house in this neighborhood? He said he wanted to be close to his and my mom's family. Then I asked him, did you know we had the worst air quality? He said no. I found out later that this isn't something realtors share to potential buyers. This past week I had 2 interactions with 2 boys, one being my son. One boy was telling his story about how his nose bleeds. He talked about how him and his friends have a hard time breathing while playing soccer. He started to cry. I believe it's because he is in fear that he could die from these toxins. The next day my son was at football practice. He came to the sideline crying. I asked him if he was hurt. He said no. I said, well, what are you crying for? He said, I can't breathe. I can't stop or my coach won't let me play. I gave him his inhaler with the hope that this will hold him off till we can go indoors. This is where it became personal for me. I wonder how different life would be if I didn't live near Suncor. While my kids wouldn't need to get breathing treatments before they went out to go and play. We wouldn't need inhalers within arm's reach, and we wouldn't have to take allergy medicine daily. As I was preparing for this presentation, I stepped outside and I had to cover my nose because the stench was so strong, and it's not something anyone wants to smell. I know it was off because the people on the Zoom call asked me, why are you covering your nose? The respiratory infections me and my kids have to deal with has caused me and my kids to miss school. It has made it hard for me to become a full-time employee. It's honestly embarrassing to call into school and to my job to tell them my kids are sick again with the same illnesses as before. Moving is not an option for us at this point. The cost of housing has made it impossible for us to leave. In 2021, the Environmental Justice Act was passed in September 2023, and still we have seen no improvement. The proposal says that Suncor needs to decrease their pollutants by 20%. To me, that seems like nothing as compared to the damage they have already done. I use my breath to breathe when I'm nervous like today. I breathe with my children to calm them down, and I relied on my breath when I was pushing my babies out of my body. But what if the air we need to cleanse our lungs and fuel our body has been poisoned and is harmful to take in? Then what? I ask today, what actions are you willing to do within the next couple months to correct these wrongs? I honestly do not understand how it's been 90 years of this pollution happening and still there is no solution to clean it up. I know Suncor does not lack in knowledge, so I'm confident they can do all that it takes to clean up their pollutant output without having to worry about losing money.
My name is Harmony Cummings. I worked in the oil and gas industry for 8 years. It was my job to pay invoices and calculate profits. There is so much money being made by these industries. We pulled from Suncor's 2022 Q4 shareholder report. They made over $5.7 billion in earnings in Canadian 2022. We estimate that comes down to their Commerce City refinery making $2.4 million in earnings a day. $2.4 million a day. Your fines mean nothing to them. That is an obscene amount of money. The rhetoric around gas prices will increase. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Gas prices on average today in Colorado are $4.08, and on the third week of March they were $4.37. So, $4.37 today, and in the third week of March, $4.08. So they're more expensive today than they were at the peak of the Suncor shutdown. That should also tell us something. And at what point do these things affect Suncor's profits instead of Coloradans' pockets? I really think we need to look at that. I think that's important. Next slide, please. You can do a quick Google search to see the millions and billions being made by these corporations. On top of Suncor's $2.4 million a day at Commerce City alone, they have recently pulled out of the renewables business and have doubled down on tar sands and oil-centered strategies. This is a slap in the face to neighboring communities, this process, and the planet. Suncor is a Canadian company, so a lot of the financial benefit doesn't even stay in this country. Let's talk about emissions on the side. Suncor's pollution is 951,000. You can add up the next 7 emitters and it doesn't even total what Suncor is doing to our state and our communities. I work and live in the community surrounding Suncor. Residents are begging for help, protections, accountability, enforcement, and action. They voice that industry air quality data says everything is fine, but this does not match with the community's lived experience. Industry and state data does not match with the community data of Calti Bondo. There continues to be a disconnect. What else are we supposed to do? The people have lost their faith and trust that government will protect them. Given the health impacts residents face and continued patterns of polluting and government inaction, they feel like their voices and pleas for help, their lives, and their children's health does not matter to you. Many of the Gen 2 companies have plenty of money to make improvements. From my time working in industry, I know that these corporations will not do better unless you make them do so. Next slide, please. Every day things get harder in DICs. This rule stems from the EJ Act, to do less harms. Is this rule doing that? We want to talk about meaningful participation. We had to overcome so many barriers to be here today. We had to win 2 grants. The juggling of childcare for meetings and things like that. I still got to run across town to get another child. And we're just barely covering basic costs and we get paid close to nothing to be here today. We are here for the good of the future, not for greed. When I went out to build this coalition, I said I have to be honest, I don't think we're here for an EJ win. We're here to stop the hemorrhaging because pollution and some industry are draining the life from our communities and steamrolling them. Next slide, please. We want to ask the commission about co-pollutants. When my kids ask if we can go to the pool tomorrow, I said it depends on the air quality. This has greatly reduced our ability to go outside this year. Are you paying attention to the ozone and the bad air days? When I talk to the kids in the community with the bloody noses and the waking up in the night with the bloody noses, this does not happen to kids in all communities. This happens to kids in DICs, and it's unfair and should be a crime for how industry's actions and government inaction impact the children. Would you want your children and grandchildren to live in these communities? If the answer is no, we need to do better. Cost effectiveness. The scales of balance have been tilted towards the industry for decades. It's more cost effective for me to dump my trash in my neighbor's yard than it is for me to pay someone to pick it up. That's what these industries are doing. They're putting their trash in the air, dumping it in their neighbor's yard, making them clean it up and pay the consequences while they make millions and billions. What is the value when we talk about cost effectiveness that you put on my child? What is the value you put on your child? And what is it the value that you put on a child in a DIC? There is no value high enough for our babies. Get rid of cost effectiveness, and at the very least, greatly increase the cost threshold. Model several models for the scenario like the PUC does, not just one. It shouldn't be this hard to fight for clean air. It shouldn't be a fight at all. We should be working together with the government to do everything we can to create a safe, healthy, and beautiful world for the children. What if instead of this fight, we were here using this time, energy, and these resources to build a beautiful world together, to rematriarch our systems, to connect with the earth and live in harmony with each other? I ask you that question today as I sit with my baby in my hand because we are moms who are terrified for the future for our babies.
Thank you very much, Commissioners. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I just wanted to highlight, what you've heard is the reason why the on-site reductions are so important in this rule. Please prioritize the on-site reductions. Please follow the statute, and please make sure that these communities can get relief much sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here, for speaking tonight. Are there any questions?
I really want to thank you for being here tonight. It's very helpful to hear directly what you're experiencing. So we appreciate that and recognize that the hour is late, and I love your hats. I wondered, there was a couple bullets on this last slide that you didn't quite get to that I wanted to understand. Under the cost effectiveness threshold, you mentioned including higher costs for specific pollutants. Could you talk a little bit more about what you're thinking there?
Putting out there that have been measured. There are standards out there. And if there's not standards, I kind of hate this. As I went through my first legislative process, and this is my first rulemaking process, that we're always looking for what someone else has done. But I think in these times, we have to be willing to be the example for what can be done as well. We have some groundwork laid for some other people, but really, what is the cost of benzene? It's higher than just your generic cost of salt or carbon and these sort of things. What's your cost of sulfur dioxide? What's the cost? These things are known to have certain outcomes that are much more impactful and cost burden to communities on the health and environment.
So Commissioner Jones, if I could just mention a little bit, what we've been talking about in our filings is that, and others have talked about it as well, is that the cost of, the FCC, the social cost of greenhouse gases, I should say, is not the same as the cost of pollution. Cost of pollution is much more extensive. What we talked about in our filings is that you have health effects, for example. It's not just the only other type of cost of pollution besides the social cost of GHG, but the cost of health effects, which is what you heard the folks up here talk about, is the cost of the health effects on the community, on the family, on themselves, on future generations. That's much more extensive than the social cost of GHG. The social cost of GHG just talks about the greenhouse gas emissions, and of course it does talk about health effects that would be a result of a warming climate, but not the health effects of the co-pollutants that are being emitted from these facilities that are affecting these communities every day. So that's part of the reason why we think that the social cost of carbon, or social cost of GHG rather, is way too low in this proposed rule.
Thank you.
Any other questions? John?
Thank you again for being here. Not an easy job, I know. Earlier, Suncor was talking about, they will be talking about, I think, the reductions in co-pollutants as a result of greenhouse gas reductions. And I would want, and they mentioned reducing production if they couldn't get some relief, and the resulting increase in fuel prices. And I just wondered how much of that members of DICs can stand so they can get to work, so they can feed their children. That there's a certain give and take or balance, and I kind of worry about the consequences of what we do. And I'm a little torn. Maybe you could help.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll mention something quickly and hand over to Ms. Cummings. But so the balance that we've seen in these communities for decades has been the balance that I think you're referring to, the cost of the goods as opposed to the communities. And what we've seen as a result is what you heard about today and what you read in our pre-hearing statement and rebuttal, as well as the public comment last night. These communities are suffering, and it of course can be a hardship to pay a little bit more for a gallon of gas. But Ms. Molina talked about family effects. Everybody's talking about community effects. These are devastating effects as a result of decades of this type of pollution. And it's just orders of magnitude more serious, we believe, than the possibility of paying a little bit more for a gallon of gasoline.
I will say too, as a mom, and there are a lot of single moms in these communities, when your child is sick and you have to miss work for those sort of things, there's a lot of disconnect between the healthcare and just getting access to a simple inhaler to these communities. The costs that come because of the pollution caused, it's very hard to quantify. But again, like I mentioned, the cost of gas today is 30 cents higher than it was in March, and Suncor is fully operational. And I think we really have to look at that. And I do a lot of work with Cultivando, and they hold up signs saying that our lives are worth more than your cheap gas. And I listen to that pretty strongly.
Sorry, just another quick one, and this might be for you, Mr. Foote. Since you used to be in the state legislature, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the letters that we received from the sponsors of the Environmental Justice Act. I just wonder if you could comment on those letters. I seem to recall some of the same themes in those letters that you're suggesting here. Just curious how you view those letters.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Jones. And it might be a bit in my self-interest or any former legislator to say they should be taken seriously. But I do think that the explanation of legislative intent matters. The courts say it matters when there's ambiguous language. So this is not just saying it as a former legislator, but there clearly needs to be some weight given to legislative intent, particularly when there's a question as to what certain words mean. And I read those letters. I also mentioned some of that in our rebuttal in particular. And it's pretty clear that the legislators that ran the bill, including those that co-sponsored the bill, not just the prime sponsors, but the co-sponsors, they truly intended for disproportionately impacted communities to be protected. That co-pollutant emission reductions in disproportionately impacted communities should be prioritized. And that the mandatory should yield to the discretionary. In other words, the slides that I went over before talk about considerations, and you are considering things like cost effectiveness. You are considering the cost of compliance. Those are important things to consider, but at the end of the day, if you have to make a choice, you have to choose what's mandatory, and that's protections and reductions of co-pollutants from disproportionately impacted communities. So I hope that this commission will take the legislative letters very seriously. I think they're a very good statement of their intent when they went through the process of passing the bill.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any parties that wish to cross-examine? Okay, seeing none, thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.
Gracias.